Hi, I'm Christine Mulkey. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first ever New York Times Food Festival, which I helped to organize with Sam Sifton. This is a festival as big and exciting as the city that inspired it. All this weekend, we've been having food tastings, live cooking demonstrations, and more just down the block in Bryant Park, which unfortunately closes at 5, but don't leave early. There are the nights, the 7 evenings with 10 of the city's greatest restaurants that Pete Wells chose. And here in the TimesCenter, we've been having the talks, a series of discussions with the most interesting and vital voices in today's food scene in New York City and beyond. Following this afternoon's talk, we invite you to enjoy a free cup of coffee from Joe in the lobby, visit our festival lounge downstairs in the hall. There you can get a free drink at the festival bar, watch the other talks as they're live streamed, enjoy a free scoop of the flavor of record created especially by the Times with Ample Hills Creamery, and much more. I'll be the one in line for getting my portrait done in foam at the Guinness stall. We'd like to give special thanks to the sponsors of the New York Times Food Festival, our presenting sponsor, MasterCard, our major sponsor, Uber Eats, our official wellness sponsor, Yogi Teas, event sponsors, Diageo, Sub-Zero, Wolf & Cove, and supporting sponsors, AARP, New York City, Badia Spices, Deloitte, and Resi, and our contributing sponsors, Joe Coffee Company and REI. And now to our program. This afternoon, we're excited to be joined by leaders of their respective industries who understand that the power of a great restaurant starts the second you cross the threshold. It's thanks to restaurateur Danny Meyer and architect and designer David Rockwell that architecture and design have become an integral part of every restaurant discussion. Please welcome them to the New York Times Center stage, along with our architecture critic, Michael Kimmelman.
Nobu, right? Hi, guys.
Hello.
And hi, everyone. So I wanted to quote myself, if I can find what I wrote, because we began a conversation about a little over 3 years ago when you were moving from that place, which had, as you can see,
that was more than a little over 3 years ago.
Yeah. It had become a little run down to a new Union Square. And I think what we want to do this afternoon, of course, is to talk about the nature of moving such a place, but also, what goes into the making of a restaurant and what role the architecture plays. We talk about the food, we talk about service, but it'd be really interesting, I think, to unpack for an audience much of what is sort of seen but not seen. And so for me, it was a real education talking to you. And I described it. I said your first signature restaurant, Union Square Cafe, will be engaged, I said, in a quasi-scientific enterprise, take one of the most cherished high-end establishments in the city, a longtime regular atop the Zagat most popular list, keep the chef, the staff, even the old favorites from the menu, but isolating the variable, move 3 blocks. Then determine precisely how much, in a business built on food and service, does place matter? And is it possible to uproot a classic without destroying its essence? So let's go back, Danny. First of all, how's Union Square Cafe doing now?
It's doing incredibly well, and that guy gets a huge amount of the credit for it.
Thank you. Well, we'll talk about all this shortly, but then let's go back to the beginning.
I want to know who did the little drawing at the bottom window pane.
So let's just, I don't know how many people here, and I can't really see, but just by hands, how many people here have eaten at Union Square Cafe?
Thank you.
Okay, and how many people, may I ask, have eaten at the new Union Square Cafe? Huh, pretty good. Okay, so for many of you this is familiar, but for some of you it's not. So Danny, can you just take us back to the origins of the restaurant and where you are there so we can...
So I was 27 years old, actually probably still 26 in that picture, and I wanted to open a restaurant that if only it existed would have been my favorite restaurant. Mm-hmm. And I love going to restaurants. I had spent some time in cooking in Italy and France because back then you weren't supposed to go into the restaurant business. It wasn't like it is today. And I found this opportunity to take over a 49-year-old vegetarian restaurant called Brownie's, which had been about a half a block from the Union Square Green Market.
And what was that like at the moment, that area, 16th Street?
It was pretty disastrous. On the industry that was starting to move out was the men's garment district. And so that very year, 1985, you would see racks and racks of clothing being wheeled up and down the street. You didn't see vegetables from the Green Market like you see today. And some photographers had begun to move into some lofts, but it was pretty dangerous around there.
Yeah, Union Square was not what it is now. It was pretty seedy.
It was, but what I loved about it was its proximity to the Green Market. And because of the time I had spent in France and Italy prior to this, I had this romantic notion of how great it would feel to be in a neighborhood, not only near a market, but also a neighborhood where the rents were low enough. And I was paying $8 a square foot when we first moved in here. I know, right now it's a rounding error on a 3-digit number that starts with 3 or 4. And I love the opportunity to be able to give good dining value and still make some money.
Yeah. David, were you in that neighborhood yet?
We moved in '93.
So not so long afterwards.
No, but I had been going to Union Square long before that and sort of graduated from different parts of the restaurant as I got to know it more. So
let's if you call up number 2. So this is what happened to that window and the entrance to the restaurant. And then if you could call up number 3. And then when you entered, you saw a bar. Actually, go to number 4. And just above the bar was the Judy Rifka mural.
Well, that was the original of 3 Judy Rifka murals we had painted in the back section of the dining room. It was a 2-story mural. And 2 quick stories, if I can. 1 month after we opened, which was Thanksgiving Friday, the Friday after Thanksgiving of 1985, we had opened on October 21. We were busy enough for the first time ever to have seated guests in the back dining room right beyond the bar. Up till that point in the first month, we didn't have enough guests to even need to use it. And I went upstairs to that balcony that you see with a friend of mine who was in from out of town. And I was going like this to show him the double height Judy Rifka mural. And as I went like this, coincidentally, the entire track lighting falls down like a guillotine, not funny, and crashes into the wall, making a 4-inch dent about 3 inches from the face of the woman who was sitting there. And we wouldn't be together but for those 3 inches right now. That was my first experience with this mural, but the next one was that the restaurant next door to us, which I forget, it could have been Metropolis Cafe or Blue Water Grill, but they were having a rough time with their air conditioning, and we shared an alley. And they decided that the way to take care of their air conditioning was to spray water on it all summer long. And all of a sudden, one August, I noticed that the entire mural had bubbled and the paint was starting to come down. And it was so awful. So we cut out the few pieces that we could salvage from the wall.
Right.
And Judy came back in and painted a second version of it.
That's wonderful. In fact, the thing about the restaurant, right, was that you had art in it, you had furniture that you'd accumulated, bits and pieces of furniture.
I want to point out one thing in that photograph that I'm not sure Danny remembers, but so one of the challenges with Union Square was really microsurgery in analyzing, how not to be the team that killed Union Square Cafe, how to have the spirit of it in a space that was very different. But that wood corbel on the right was instrumental in creating the wood arches that you see now in the new Union Square Cafe, and that little piece of millwork with a wine on it on the left. All of those were sort of clues to how Danny and his team had inhabited the space on 16th Street and built hospitality in unexpected places.
Right.
So those were sort of part of the archaeology of
we chose to leave those behind. Those were umbrella racks right there. They were awful.
We considered it. They were plexi and sort of awful, but they were a good idea.
So let's go to the next photograph, which actually is a little bit of a lower shot from the balcony, I guess, looking back. David, when you look at this, what are you seeing? This is the old Union Square bar.
Well, I'm seeing two very different things. One thing is it was a great place to eat, and people who ate there were very protective of what they thought made it a great place to eat. It may not have been a great place to be a bartender because there were no service stations in the middle, and it was a very compressed space. But the space to the right of it, which had a wall on the other side, we felt like in the new space, which is a big open space, there were things about the bar spatially that really made sense, and one was the intimacy of the ceiling, and the other one was the relationship of the bar to the chairs to the space behind it. So we kind of inscribed that in the new space. And actually that bar became a piece that we used upstairs. We took that bar, including those light fixtures. And
we'll get to that in a minute.
I'm jumping the gun.
But no, a little bit, yeah. Because
I was getting momentum there.
That's right. I mean, what I'm trying to do is allow people to either remember or to see the old Union Square through both of your eyes, in a sense, so one can understand it both as a place, as a business, but also a place to eat and experience, but then also architecturally.
So we did consider replicating some of the spatial deficiencies of the original one. We ultimately decided not to do that in conversation with Danny, but when I see this, I just remember the conversation about how to create a bar that had the same level of energy.
Right, and we were very, very concerned because there were, at the original Union Square Cafe, it's the only restaurant I've ever seen in my life where people would wait in the dining room for the purpose of getting a seat at the bar.
So if you could get a number 7,
see that,
actually.
And we did not want to screw that up, and it was the weirdest. You can see right here, this is a great shot. I think I took it.
Why did they do that, Danny? Why did people, and I did that, why did people
look at all these people waiting for a seat at the bar? Because there was something about that community, and none of it should have worked. It was a complete compromise. As David just said, the bartenders had to shimmy around one another behind the bar. Your knees had to shimmy with the underbar because we couldn't build the bar top wide enough in order for people to actually have egress back and forth through the restaurant. And don't forget that our coat room was all the way down here and around the corner from the bar, so the coat checker in the front would be carrying 3 or 4 coats deep by all these people while food was going back and forth. And you say, well, how in the world did that possibly work? And the fact is, people want to be with people. And one of the things that restaurants can do, besides doing the shopping and the cooking and doing the dishes, is they give people a chance to be with people. And I think we sometimes make a mistake in sometimes creating too much space.
Limitations are helpful, and the new space had limitations that force interesting solutions in the same way.
I mean, but I want to get to that in a moment, David, because in a way you had so much more room in the new space to play with, and here you're talking about a space that was really not a very practical one. I mean, if you go to number 6, off this bar was the main dining area, which was a few steps down with the windows now looking, that's the other side of that window. This was also the most desirable room, I guess, to eat in.
It was, and again, it should never have worked. You could touch the ceiling with your feet on the ground. There were many, many occasions where the neighbor upstairs, she would forget to turn off her bath water, and we'd end up having a flood beneath here. And back in the old days when there was smoking permitted in the restaurant, this was pre-1990 when we eliminated smoking, the ceilings would often be completely browned. And a contractor gave me the idea that no one here should ever do, which was, he said, oh, that's simple, just get out some white paint and it'll go away, which of course renders the absorptive ceiling completely useless. The other thing, if you notice on the left soffit, if I had a nickel for every person who said that we were causing them to catch the flu because of the draft, we ended up, when you have a 7-foot ceiling or whatever it was, 7'2", of course you're going to have a draft on people. So we found these kind of R2-D2 things that disperse the air that way instead of down on you.
Kind of.
They were pretty hideous.
It was also interesting. This became is a friend of the restaurants up until it closed. This ceiling became a laboratory for every new light fixture. where Danny and his team would try and adopt different ways to take this low ceiling and both absorb sound and
Right, and we didn't even have enough room to have recessed lighting here
yeah.
because there was no space between the floor above and this to house it.
But you're raising a very interesting issue. So I hope what people are understanding from this is this was a kind of lousy space with a lot of problems. And it had a Siberia in the back and that balcony you described.
That was my favorite place to eat.
But not everybody's.
You were hiding, though, is why you were.
That's true.
And yet, it was an incredibly beloved institution for a lot of reasons, but the space was beloved too. People liked to be there. So you just mentioned something interesting, David, which is the lighting. When you look at this, what do you see in terms of the experience of eating at one of those tables?
Well, that's a slightly loaded question because we've really studied it to say what are the qualities of it that are worth reproducing without inheriting those conditions. And one of them is there was a great layout of distances between the tables, which we measured and paid a lot of attention to. And the amount of light on the table versus the amount of light on the fall off of the table was really good. And it was something Danny and his team and I talked and mocked up a lot.
Can you explain that a little further?
Sure. So, there's many different strategies about how to light a restaurant, from totally ambient lighting, like Balthazar or something, which is a glowing space, or pin spots where you're specifically lighting the table. And here, the tables were lit, and they were lit with a color temperature that worked, really well for the food. But the fall off to circulation wasn't high contrast, so it felt very lively.
And there was natural light, but not a lot of natural light.
There was natural light, and one of the challenges in the new space is how much natural light there was. And this view towards the street shows that great mullioned window on 16th Street with that curtain below, which really were great clues to what made this room really intimate, including the wainscoting, like establishing that line of the green.
And keep in mind, this is a sunken room, so we had to do the curtains because otherwise you'd be looking down. In the early days of Union Square Cafe, when we didn't have the curtain, I can't believe I'm sharing this, but people would come on a Friday and Saturday night drunk and moon the entire dining room. That's actually true. Just again, to show you, there's a lot in this very, very imperfect room, a lot of details that fit into hospitality. One is that when I built this in 1985, one of the things I really, really regret to this day is that we didn't have the money to level the foundation beneath the floor. And we put this cherry wood floor in that was always unlevel and unsunk. And so we had to create table levelers that would compensate for that. Because there's just nothing worse, I think, than getting a rocky table when you go in the restaurant. And then the ceiling also created all these sound issues. And sound is so crucial because it's like salt. You don't want too much, you don't want too little. You want enough sound so that we don't have to whisper to be with each other, but not so much that they enter our conversation.
And sound was a big part of the new Union Square.
It was, in fact, I can't wait till we get to the new one, because on opening night, when we were as busy as we could possibly be, and I didn't hear one person straining, I didn't see one person straining to be heard, I said, you nailed it. And not easy to do that.
So, but when people...
When you mentioned it was a limited space, it was a found space.
Yeah.
It felt residential in scale, and you went from room to room, you made a decision to step down to this room. So inheriting a big open space like we had on 19th Street, one of the questions was, how do you inscribe a sense of rooms and community with a big open space? Right. And the answer was much more vertically than it was.
I mean, this was a space that felt cobbled together and kind of domestic, right? You walked in, there was a hall, there was a parlor to your right, there was a back room. It didn't feel like anybody had designed it. And that sense in which of sort of very little effort, it wasn't very little effort, but of
and by the way, a really talented guy named Larry Bogdanow did design
this. This is what I was getting to,
with Danny, who he found, who's mostly residential.
So I was going to ask you about that, because it had that effect of seeming like you just found some furniture you'd had and put up some pictures and somehow, and that made it warmer.
Well, actually...
But it wasn't, was it?
It wasn't. I mean, I was lucky to meet Larry and his partner, Warren Ashworth. And I met them through a family friend from St. Louis because they'd both gone to Washington University, but they'd never done a restaurant before.
Yeah.
And the very first meeting, I said, I want a restaurant that looks like there was never a designer here.
Huh.
And
why? Why?
I wanted a restaurant. I said two things. I don't want to buy. When I was growing up, people would have lithographs, families, nice lithographs, but maybe there was a Miro lithograph or a Gam. I'm trying to think of some of and they all they got a Calder, they got it, but they weren't original, and it felt like they were just designing their place to look like they were in the know, and I wanted to just make a place where you didn't actually know whether you had gone out or come home. And I think in a weird sense, the impracticality of this space, that actually had 5 levels between the guy making the gnocchi in the basement and what you called Siberia, my favorite table on the balcony. I think in a weird way, the adversity of that space is what led to even more hospitality, because we had to overcome a lot of discomfort to make people feel comfortable.
God forbid you try and get to the bathroom and cross the kitchen.
Right.
So
what were but there was huge actual problems for you in running this business, which had to do with the layout too,
and it was one of the things Danny was most interested in exercising in the new place.
What was the kitchen like? Nobody got into it, so tell us.
Well, actually, that's what led to Gramercy Tavern, because I wanted to right every wrong that we were living with here. Better kitchen, better coat room, more space behind the bar, actual locker rooms for the staff as opposed to a co-ed closet, which, it was awful. And then with the new Union Square Cafe, we had a space where we could do a lot of this, but you didn't want to lose.
Exactly.
As a matter of fact, I think the brilliance of what you and your team did was to keep things idiosyncratic and make them work better all at the same time. Because if all we did was kind of homogenize Union Square Cafe, it wouldn't be Union Square Cafe.
But what I was asking was, just so people know, where was the kitchen? You said it was 4 levels down or something?
Well, the kitchen was right back.
You're sitting
right where
You're
we are.
sitting in the kitchen, and keep in mind, this had been the kitchen for a vegetarian restaurant, and they didn't do a lot of cooking. It was like carrot salad with raisins and, cups of muffins and that kind of thing. It just wasn't, there wasn't a lot of cooking there. And my office was, I was the reservationist at the beginning, answering 2 phones at the same time. It was kind of crazy.
At least they were both ringing.
Once I started laughing because I couldn't keep up with 2 and I hung up on both of them, which was kind of not hospitable. But my little office, we had to actually expand the kitchen, and so we turned my office into the dishwashing station and turned the dishwashing station into the pastry station and moved my office up to the balcony, taking over space that had never even existed. We just took some steel and expanded the balcony at this point. But that was the kitchen, and I'm amazed that we got 3 stars from the New York Times a couple times from that kitchen.
How many covers did you do a night?
On a Saturday night, we'd serve 300 people, which is a lot for anyone who's in the restaurant business. That's not a little. And to have that quality of cook and pastry chef say, I'm willing to work under those conditions, and they'd go down to the basement to hand roll the pasta like this, because the basement was about, you were down there at some point, and you lived to tell the story. That was about 6.5 feet tall.
That was subhuman down there.
Yes. I'm embarrassed, but it's the fact.
The thing that I remember about the earliest meals at Union Square Cafe is after 3 or 4 meals, the waiters knew my preferences on food. They really paid attention to who was there, and it was a kind of culture.
Well, I'm not talking so much about the hospitality side of this, because I think it's taken for granted that you sort of embody the idea of how to do this absolutely right. I think what's interesting about the restaurant is what was sort of, in a sense, wrong with it. that you turned into assets, but then also had to sort of calculate when you moved what were you going to take. You could say what you were going to fix, you could say what you liked, but what were those kind of intangible things here? A little bit what we've been talking about, which is harder to transport.
Well, it's easier to look at those when you look at the new one, because you can kind of...
Yeah, so maybe we could go to 10, which is going to force people to look at plans. David, could you just explain what these two are, just very briefly? So
the plan on the left is the Union Square Cafe on 16th Street. 16th Street is up and down on the page. You can see the entrance at the top of the page. You pass the narrow bar with a constricted space into the back room or down into the main dining room. And you see the size of the kitchen relative to the space. And on the right is the new Union Square Cafe. And there were a couple of things. I mean, if you looked at the amount of drawings that were done to get to a solution, there were, a year of thousands of drawings. And one of the things that we were obsessed with Danny was where the entrance was going to be. So it is off 19th Street, right off the corner, and you enter looking into the bar. So in both cases, there's a sense of choreography. You're moving from space to space. Really, the space we were inheriting was one big room, but by entering and looking at the bar with a tile pattern that's roughly the same size as the bar to the wall on the existing, you can start to see that the rooms, as you move past the stair, that dining room is roughly the same size as the main dining room.
So for people who are maybe having trouble reading
That wasn't clear?
I thought it was perfect. Could you go to 19? So, just so people see, we started with the photograph of the other one. This is the photo of the new restaurant. It's not so new now, 3 years old. The current Union Square. And if you go to 22, and this is the entrance you were describing. So now, David, maybe you could again explain some of the elements that, first of all, what was here before?
Most previously it was City Crab, which was a restaurant that had a balcony, and I think we didn't quite realize that everything was going to have to come down. So essentially this was totally rebuilt.
How did it have to come down? Because?
Many reasons. It didn't work in terms of planning.
Yeah.
There were structural issues, there were mechanical issues, all new mechanical systems. I mean, there aren't a lot of restaurateurs that think about the longevity the way Union Square Hospitality does, so they really built this to last, and that required major systems work.
But
to put it mildly.
But Denny, when you were looking for spaces,
we actually had to excavate the basement here.
And the sidewalk.
And the sidewalk.
And rebuild the entire balcony.
Yeah.
I thought we were so smart.
And have the chairs be comfortable.
Oh yeah, that too.
I mean, when you started on this, and when I first started to meet with you, one of the curiosities was, how do you move Union Square? What kind of a place are you looking for? And you actually found something that, on the face of it, is kind of the opposite. It's a big lofted, double height space on Park Avenue. You were on a dead-end street before. And it doesn't have a little balcony. It has a very large second floor area. It's not a maze of spaces. It's
well, it actually is. Upstairs, especially.
It is now. But I'm just saying, so why did you pick this place? How did you choose it?
Well, we were getting pretty frustrated. Once we learned that we were not going to be able to renew our lease without, I think, almost triple the rent. The two birds I had on either shoulder, one was, 30 years, it's been great. What more do you need to accomplish? Just say goodbye. It's been great. And I didn't want to listen to that bird. I was not ready to say goodbye to the Union Square Cafe story at all. And the next bird was, okay, well, if you're going to open another Union Square Cafe, you better make sure that you can credibly call it Union Square Cafe. So that then really, really limited where we could look, because we wanted to be able to have our chef and porters push a vegetable cart. I think we said no more than a 6-minute walk from the farmer's market, from the green market. And we had spent almost an entire year and a half looking at spaces, because we were engaged in conversations with our landlord for a couple of years before this. We knew that this day was going to come. And it was really, really tough. And then this space was never even on the market. It's just that I knew a tenant in the building who knew the landlord, and literally shook this space out of the tree as if it was an unripe coconut that wasn't ready to fall off. And I was just amazed that we got it. It was City Crab plus another little space that they also own, which was called Duke's Barbecue. And yes, you're right. You know, that double height space is exactly the opposite of the 7-foot ceiling.
And Danny walked me in there and said, "Can you make this work?" I was terrified, and of course I said yes.
Why were you terrified?
Because it's a lot of responsibility to take a place that was known for a certain kind of character and think about. I thought that was a real responsibility, and it wasn't
kill
so,
a landmark.
It wasn't so. And the landmark was the experience of the landmark. We tend to think of landmark as just the sticks and bricks, but it wasn't the physical place of Union Square. So I said yes, and then figured out we'd figure out how to.
And we talked about this incessantly. We had worked on Maialino together, and quick little backstory, which I think is a good one. David had become quite an amazingly loyal regular guest at Union Square Cafe. So I knew he knew the restaurant from a guest experience. We had never worked together until Maialino.
We almost did it, because there were a couple of false starts.
There were a couple of false starts, but we never had. And David would always go, I can't eat here anymore unless I do business. I can't bring my clients in and have them say, why are you eating in his restaurant instead of mine, when he doesn't even do business with
I
you?
had a lot of pissed off clients who were like, what the hell, you're eating at Danny's restaurant.
So,
you don't even work for him.
But I knew, here's the big challenge. And this was something we thought about a lot. It just so happens that this was, we were losing our lease at exactly the same time as a really famous restaurant, the Four Seasons, was losing its lease. And we thought about this very consciously, and I was able to draw a distinction in my mind that actually alleviated some of my fear. And that is that if you asked any 10 people who loved Union Square Cafe, what are your top 2 or 3 favorite things about it? Almost no one mentioned the space. They mentioned how it felt. They mentioned the food. They love our staff. If you ask 10 people who love the Four Seasons, what do they most love about the Four Seasons? In the top 3 were always the space. And I knew that we actually weren't going to face that challenge, because no one was going to say, oh my gosh, I miss the ladies' bathroom so much. It's just terrifying to me to have more space. And so I said, if we can transport the spirit, this was our first conversation, transport the spirit. I know we can make better food because we're going to have a far better kitchen. If we can transport the spirit and have better food, I think we can make this work.
You also said something else, which I remember, which is we need to approach this in a way where neither one of us has anything to prove. Let's approach this. So we met weekly in the space. And it was really like an experiential X-ray of the original one. So while the ceiling's much higher, all those light fixtures float at the height of the main dining room in Union Square. So they create an implied ceiling. The bar is exactly the same length as the original bar. And then
to the half inch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we spent weeks with models locating artwork in relation to seats, trying to sort of analyze the spirit. And the chairs was also an interesting thing, because there were things about the original chairs that...
Can you go to 24?
So we brought in about 20 chairs to try out. And there was no chair that felt like the original Union Square Cafe, but was sittable for more than an hour. So we made a custom chair that did both those things.
If you go back to 6 for a second, you essentially tried to make a better version, a 2.0
We tried to inhabit the spirit of that, but have it be really
And
comfortable.
those are just classic bistro trattoria chairs right there. Yeah. The ones you see right here that have those nice green cushions, that meant that I had hit the big time. That was after we got our New York Times 3-star review, because the original chairs had no cushions. And I got a letter once from someone that said, I love everything about your restaurant except you make us wait too long for our food on instruments of fanny torture. And so we upgraded with the little green cushion, but then we really upgraded in the new restaurant.
So you did, but I mean, we're not talking about, since you mentioned the Four Seasons, I mean, you didn't put in Mies chairs, or you didn't, it's not Bertoya, or you don't have, so there's a way in which you were trying to also evoke something of the look.
But where we did splurge in terms of money, if you go to one of the...
Yeah, go back to, what do you want, David?
Anyone that would show the balcony rail, which is an example of...
Yeah, just one sec. So 30, please.
So here you're looking from above, and you see that those light fixtures, which are really equivalent to a theatrical scrim, they're perforated metal, and they have uplights. So they're the apparent lighting source. You feel like those are creating the glow, but the glow is coming from those light fixtures. But that ceiling is a place where we did splurge in terms of money, both acoustical, fabric, bronze fixtures that were all LED. All the lighting other than the picture lights is LED. And the railing, is an example, is a walnut railing with bronze inset that has the kind of solid quality that you just, that has a sense that it might have been there for some time. And you can see those corbels that I mentioned, which are curved here, that reference the, and I think you said that had something to do with your interest in Italy, the original corbel in the one on 16th Street.
What is a corbel?
The little wood thing on the ceiling, the art.
Oh, the arch, yeah, the sense of welcome. I never heard it called
That's like
that.
an Abbott and Costello.
I just
Corbel
learned
with
something.
you.
So would you?
Yeah, I just, I got a chance to see this picture, and at the very day that I saw this picture, a cousin of mine in Chicago sent me, just out of the blue, a passage from a 1915 novel by Willa Cather. Some of you know who Willa Cather was? 1915, this is what she wrote. And look at this, because this is what I think David accomplished right here. At 9 o'clock that evening, our 3 friends were seated in the balcony of a French restaurant, much gayer and more intimate than any that exists in New York City today. This old restaurant was built by a lover of pleasure who knew that to dine gaily, human beings must have the reassurance of certain limitations of space and of a certain definite style, that the walls must be near enough to suggest shelter, that the ceiling high enough to give the chandeliers a setting. The place was crowded with the kind of people who dine late and well. And Dr. Archie, as he watched the animated groups in the long room below the balcony, found this much the most festive scene he had ever looked out upon. He said to himself in a jovial mood, somewhat sustained by the cheer of the board, that this evening alone was well worth his long journey.
It's nice.
I think you must have read that before you did this.
Amazing.
There were a couple things, I don't want to take up too much time with this, but there were 3 things we've talked about a lot, and you guys, I know, thought about a lot, and what was really interesting about it to me was how these are subliminal things: light, sound, and then some of the visual cues, like the mullions on the windows. So let's just go in that order, and just describe. You've started to, David, but do it maybe a little more specifically. We looked at the light in the earlier Union Square incarnation. How did you you create in a much different space with giant windows, or how did you try to create some of that same sense of, well, the ambient, but also the kind of warm lighting you were describing?
Well, let's start with the windows, because I think early on we knew that those large plate windows wanted to have mullions and some variation of reference to Union Square. But I think, one of the great challenges is to have a point of view that makes every design decision not arbitrary, that it all goes back to some process of what you're trying to solve. So the division of the mullions, and you can't quite see it in this photograph, but the large transom above, on the left you see a mirror over the door, and to the right, those upper windows actually are frosted around the perimeter. And what's inset, there you go.
Yeah, thank you.
What's inset clear in that transom describes roughly the size of the facade at 16th Street. So it kind of frames the city. And then as the glass comes down, Danny was reminding us the other day that we removed that curtain. We had the cafe curtains around the perimeter, but the cafe curtains gave us an opportunity to graze them with light, which is similar to what you do in a photo studio, so that all the people sitting around the perimeter had flattering side lighting. So there's the apparent light source, which are these pendant fixtures over the bar, those bronze and copper spun fixtures that hang over the bar at the same height as the Larry Bogdanow fixtures. And then we used lighting to create accents, and it was challenging because
Let me interrupt for 1 second. Just to underscore this point, those fixtures which people think are the lights on their table actually are a scrim that brings down your eye in that large space, right? So
bring down your eye from below and from above, give you a sense that that you're in this kind of upper space.
So they're kind of an illusion. It's kind of, they're not really doing what you think, they're doing something.
Well, they're creating intimacy.
Right.
In a space that may not otherwise feel that way.
Right.
But we're not burdening them with having to do the job of actually lighting the tables.
So they're lights that don't actually light the table. But
if you were to turn them off, what they would do, your eye adjusts to the, that's why I mentioned the fall off of the table, the side lighting. So I think they create a sense of glow from above and from below. And you can see them here as you.
And then where else does the light actually come onto the tables from?
From the ceiling. Some light comes from the scrim. You certainly get bounce light, all the picture lights, which we had to work out as we were selecting the artwork. So every painting's or piece of art's lit.
I want to comment on that. David, I think you glossed over this point earlier. Michael, when you asked what do we decide to bring and what do we decide not to bring, cherry wood floor was really important to me. The art was really important to me. Some of the gestures, you see the pendants over the bar, but that was David saying, but we're not going to use the same Venetian lights that we had. We'll put those upstairs where we have half of the original bar, but on the new bar, we're going to make it new. And one of the gestures to make this massive space that you pointed out is very different. Feel intimate, right? We're not talking about a game of inches like we did at the first bar. We're talking about width, depth, height, everything. And every single gesture, whether it's lowering the chandeliers in the dining room, or every one of those picture lights feels very domestic. And the furniture. It doesn't feel like a modern New York lofty restaurant.
Danny mentioned the umbrella thing, which we ultimately didn't use, but there was something about the scale of the millwork dividing the rooms that does happen here. So you can see the host stand, the counter behind it, the area rug that defines a small space, and then right in front of that stair that turns up, there's another piece of millwork. So the millwork in the service stations, the actual place where waiters go to do what they do, defines the room. So they're sort of defined by those hospitality moves.
I mean, I remember in these meetings, what was really interesting was you were like very specific about, you may not know what corbels was, but you really knew what mullions were, and you really wanted very specific mullions.
I knew what arches were, I just didn't know them called
corbels. You didn't know.
No.
But you and your guys were like, the turning radius of a barista is this, and the absorptive quality of this particular kind of stone is going to be that for a bar, and so forth. You're very specific about this. And you brought a different kind of expertise, and I wanted to quote what you told me, which I put into that article I mentioned earlier, because I thought it was super interesting. The best restaurant designs are made up of large decisions and lots of tiny details, but ultimately, what comes from long experience, Danny's and mine, involves what I'd called in-between things. Designing for when a restaurant isn't full. Ensuring there's easy eye contact with every table with the waiter station, so diners always feel in control, never swallowed up in a big space. Designing spaces so people want to explore the room, because a restaurant shouldn't be a one-liner. A restaurant should unfold like a series of snapshots. That was part of what defined the original Union Square Cafe. It was episodic. I found that very interesting. Do you guys both think about what a restaurant looks like when it's half full, and how people in their seats perceive where the service is in relation to them?
No question that the first group of people coming to a room, sort of sets a tone, and part of what I think I've come to realize is if you're in a restaurant and you're able to get service, the food gets there. The design is helped by all those decisions that really help the operator understand how to make it live and breathe. And it's also interesting to go there sometimes for lunch and try different seats and see the perspective of those different rooms.
Yeah, I think one of the things, maybe we all agree about this, is what had been Siberia in your other restaurant that you loved, actually here is an entirely different space, very much like that quote. A space in which those booths that are really where we're looking from, and then sorry, let me show a different photo of this to make it clear. But you guys essentially conceived several different spaces out of that upstairs area, or 4 of them.
The booths and the separate bar in some ways are like a restaurant within the restaurant for regulars. It's the old bar with a series of booths. It feels like its own destination.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to 30, it's, this is fine, but this is essentially seen from those booths which look out over. And then this area is also another seating area. And then to the side over here, you actually transported part of the original bar in a kind of little
Do you have
nook.
a picture of that? And that's where we put the Klaus Oldenburg.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it here. Do you see it? And then there's, there we go.
Yeah. So that's the original bar set in a new space.
Half of it, exactly half.
Yeah.
Do you think people know that?
Oh yeah. In fact, one of my big concerns when we opened here would be people, what happened to your bar? And I would go, come with me. And there's something about touching that piece of mahogany that so many people loved, so many different lunches and dinners and cocktail hours there. Just touching it feels good. It really does.
What I was going to say is I think the great thing is you don't have to get that. Part of what we do is lavish all this attention and time to create a context for this hour-and-a-half spontaneous connection you might have dining there. And if you don't get any of the design references, you still get the benefit of.
And those light fixtures were the original ones as well. And you reset them.
Which you brought from 16th Street.
Yeah.
That low ceiling in this case is walnut paneling with micro perforations with sound absorption beyond it. So you're able to have a low, cozy ceiling where you can really talk.
To keep that sense that as you had at the old Union Square, which it wasn't too loud, wasn't too soft. We haven't talked about daily provisions, which is the thing you made out of the old barbecue place, and much else. But I want to leave time for people to ask some questions if you have some. And maybe, I think you're supposed to move to the side, and there's a place to ask them from. I know that sounds confused, but because I'm confused. Can you guys think of another restaurant that has successfully moved? I think we came up with one the other day. But there are not many examples, are there? Four Seasons actually didn't work.
No, there's a number that have not worked. One that I know did work spectacularly, although they changed the spirit of the restaurant, was Spago. It had gone from West Hollywood to Beverly Hills.
But they did the opposite, right? Because they're not going to try to reproduce the ethos of that place will just create a whole new place.
Well, Pastis recently, moved and feels very much like the original. So they were able to.
In a similar space. Is anybody standing by the? Have we stunned you into silence? Yeah.
Came to New York about 100 years ago and started a market called Balducci's in Greenwich Village. And he was really inspired by the idea of bringing a Italian market to New York and sharing what that means to Greenwich Village as a community. So Danny, could you talk about your love of markets and what that meant to you in your time abroad and how you felt you brought that to New York?
Well, my love for markets is kind of embedded in any kind of trip I ever take anywhere. I try to learn about people based on how they eat. And I think the markets in any city, in any part of the world, and I'm not even just talking about the open markets, but even seeing how butchers feel different or how supermarkets even feel different city by city, for me is, it's odd. My family doesn't love this about me, but I'd rather go there first, even before all the things you're supposed to see in that city, because I really get a window into people based on how they eat. And thank you for your grandfather, because all of us New Yorkers have had a better experience because of that.
Absolutely true. Yep.
I know we talked a lot about the different architectural elements, but one thing that as a frequenter to many of your restaurants that I find super warm is really the decor that goes beyond just the art, but also the like the flowers and the table displays, and you see it throughout all of them. It's very consistent. How did you come up with that? Because I think it's a very difficult element to really put your fingers on, because if it's just empty architecture, it feels cold.
Let me start that one, because I think you put your finger on something that's so important, which is, I think there's a sense that architecture in a restaurant exists outside of when it's alive. And I think it's a lot like a theater piece. It comes alive when there's an audience and when there's people in it. And all of those memorable things, and Danny was gracious enough, and his team, with those conversations about everything from what was in the flower box outside to, it's one of the rare restaurants when I go back to, it looks better than it did the last time I was there because of how much the people care for all those things that were done. But those are the things that forge memories, and all those details really matter.
They do, and art it's one of those details that I know matters differently to different people. And I was fortunate to grow up with a mom and dad in St. Louis that each had a really, really good eye for art. In fact, my mom had an art gallery when I was growing up. And it just, to this day, it's not something that I want to delegate to anybody else, picking the art. And I did have an experience with the original Union Square Cafe of working with the very same uncle that told me I should not be a lawyer and I should be a restaurateur. Thank God for him. And he did a lot of the original art, but he also took me to a lot of galleries growing up. If we saw some of those pictures of the art in Union Square Cafe, my college graduation present is hanging on the wall at Union Square Cafe right now.
I've got to tell the story though. So when we got to thinking about where the art was going to go, and it was open to the art throughout the history at Union Square, we made a model of the space and a model of every piece of art with tweezers and sat there for weeks with
Velcroing the little baby tweezer pieces on the wall. That's how much it mattered. And
Can you just put on 12 even though the lights are on?
I'll say that the exact same art looks so much better at the new Union Square Cafe. Oh my gosh, I guess that did happen.
Because it really is a million little decisions that end up creating that environment.
Thank you.
Look at all the people looking at us like we're crazy.
The guy going like this must be in charge of the money. He's thinking, Jesus.
I didn't buy new art after all.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Actually, my wife does, but she won't come up, so.
This sounds like no-fault insurance.
Yes.
If it's a good question, you get credit, but if it's not, she gets the blame.
Thank you, yeah. So I have not been in the restaurant business, and I'm in my 50s, and I'm just passionate about spaces and restaurants and what have you. I am a landscape architect, and have been really wanting to start a restaurant. And so we've decided to do this. We've got a great outdoor space, and we're building a kitchen in a big Airstream and what have you. But my wife is a wreck because of the time. She's very concerned about. We actually really believe we can pull this off, particularly if we're both there. But how do you really, create a culture where the establishment really lives with a lot of passion when you can't be there? May not be a question, but a statement, but some thoughts on. And we've worked at different places in organizations that have had, a culture where people take care of the business when the owner's not there. I was one of them. So I think we can create that, but I'd love to hear your viewpoint on it.
You absolutely can create that. The way that happens is to make sure the foundation of the culture are your values, and they never change, but the culture does change, because the culture is just a way of saying how you do things, and how you do things will change, has to change. But your values are really what drive why people want to be on your team, and they will take care of it, especially when they believe that you take care of them.
And you might think I would side on the side of make sure you hire a good architect, but I think, more importantly, start to study places you like. I'd mentioned to both these guys, when we were doing Union Square Cafe, I went to a little place on the Lower East Side with a friend of mine who's a lighting designer. And after a couple glasses of wine, we talked about the found really good decisions that place had made. So I think by looking at places you like and having a tape measure things, start to get a sense of what are the things that create the places you like.
And that's actually what I did as a 26-year-old, spending about, 4 or 5 months in Italy and in France. And I kept a notebook. You would laugh if you saw my sketches, but every time I saw something, not some person, but something design-wise that made me feel good.
Danny responds to sketches.
I do, and I was writing these sketches, and what translates to everybody is when it comes from your heart. Make it authentic; it'll work.
Thank you both.
We have time for maybe a couple more. Yeah.
Actually, 2 questions, but you can skip one if there's someone else. So one is, Danny, you talked all about the old Union Square Cafe and the new place, almost sort of like someone describing a child that's now grown up to be an adult. And as our kids grow, there are things we very much enjoy, but there are things we miss about them when they were babies. And so my question is, what is it that you miss about your old baby, or your young baby, as it were? And to David, sort of, what if you had to sort of do this all over again? Is there anything that you wish you had done differently? The other question, maybe related, but is so New York's changed in about 35 years. I've lived here for about 35 years, and it's transformed, and particularly that area has changed in a very significant way, as you described. And did you feel compelled in any way that you had, while I understand you wanted to recreate that atmosphere and feel, was there anything you felt that you actually had to do a little differently so as to play to the times, or did you sort of try to ignore that?
Okay. There's the last night of Union Square Cafe was December 15th or something like that in 2015. And we had a big lead up to it, and I was beside myself. As a matter of fact, I dined there on the very, very last night with my wife and a couple other people. And I walked out that night, and I couldn't stop my tears from just flooding the sidewalk on 26th Street, on 16th Street. And I haven't had a desire to walk back in there once ever since that point, and I don't miss anything. If there's any one thing from an architectural design standpoint that I miss, because I still have it, and you know, I have all the memories. That's where I learned how to be a restaurateur. It was the only restaurant I had for the first 10 years of my career. There's one feature that, while it was never comfortable, it really, really worked, and that was the maitre d' stand where I spent the first 10 years of my career, that was actually built into the bar. And I loved just being face to face with people right when they walked in. And I loved that at the beginning, while I was being face to face, and not just me, but any maitre d' or host we had, there were generally 2 guests at the end of the bar watching every one of these hospitality transactions. And we would show off our hospitality for them. So I miss the opportunity, and we tried to do something like that at the new one. Yeah. As far as the second part of your question was, what's different? I mean, everything's different. New York is completely different. We made one decision early on that I think recognized this, and Michael, I think, said, I think that's the first time it's ever happened in New York's history that somebody filed to lose a Park Avenue address and move it to 19th Street. And we purposely had the entrance of the restaurant be on 19th Street because we did not want to join the new world, which had become the very, very commercial, busy Park Avenue South. And just that tiny little gesture, it's a pain in the neck when you're trying to get out of your taxi. Not really, it's not that bad.
And you're not mentioning we took the pavers from the original Union Square and embedded those in the floor.
Oh yeah, we did.
As you come around 19th Street. Which is
to signal that it's on that side.
We didn't talk about Daily Provisions, which is right next to Union Square and really teeny, and more design effort and time per square inch than anything I'd experienced in 35 years of being an architect in New York. And what we thought was going to happen, so isn't what happens there now. And that was an interesting lesson. We talked about things changing from day to night. We had solved for, you know, a 2-minute drill down the field of how things were going to rearrange. And what I learned is Danny held back on certain decisions. And it reminds me of working on a theater piece out of town that's coming to New York, and a director will say, as a set designer, let's not design the set for the end of the show, because until we see the audience, we don't know how the show ends. Let's really let it evolve. And that's part of what we ended up doing at Daily Provisions in terms of where the host really was. And
that changed 3 times within the 3 days leading up to opening it.
Yeah, and all those pieces are movable because we thought the room was going to kind of rearrange. But it was a lesson in define the perimeter, define the DNA of it, and let the story sort of evolve.
I mean, we've run out of time, and we could talk about Daily Provisions as long as we talked about the other. The only thing I'll just add to this is, if people don't realize, there are now Daily Provisions around town, including one on the Upper West Side that just opened. And I was joining you to watch you talk about Union Square Cafe, and I would see you regularly. And per square foot, I've never seen more conversation about this tiny place. It was really conceiving what this should be in the most constrained circumstances. It was the opposite.
Full-scale mock-ups.
Yeah, it was the opposite of what you had next door, which is an abundance of room to make it seem more intimate. Here you had basically the size of somebody's studio apartment.
Right. So just so as long as we're here, and I know we're out of time right now, but just above this picture is the private dining room of Union Square Cafe, and just behind it is the kitchen of Union Square Cafe. And the reason that this kept consuming time is that Union Square Cafe was the thing, and we had to get it right. And every time Union Square Cafe claimed another inch, Daily Provisions lost that inch.
It's what happens when you ask the chef, how much room do you want?
All right, don't ever do that. Where's your wife? Okay, don't do that.
So listen, we could do this another time. I don't want to keep everybody here. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.